Good evening, and welcome back to 31 Horror Nights. It's October 5th, and tonight's movie is Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Okay, before we get into anything, you might be wondering, where are all those found footage movies I promised? I'm wondering the same thing. Out of the 29 movies I'm randomly drawing from every day, 16 of them are found footage. It is statistically very unlikely that we haven't gotten one yet, but whatever, we'll get to them eventually. But back to the topic at hand, this is probably one of the most well-known movies I'm going to be looking at this month because it's based off of a children's book series that's very infamous for its illustrations and its stories, and it has left an impact on a lot of people. Personally, I've never read those books. I hadn't even heard of them until my childhood was well behind me, and maybe that doesn't make me the perfect person to review this movie, but a good adaptation should stand on its own. I mentioned this movie briefly last year when I was talking about the director André Øvredal. I've seen two of his movies so far. The first one was Troll Hunter, which I thought was pretty good, and the second one was The Autopsy of Jane Doe, which I thought was excellent. I think the most important thing in this movie is going to be the visuals, because the illustrations in the original book series are very famous, very iconic, and they have a very particular style to it, and I'll see if that appears in the movie, because I've looked at some of the illustrations to prepare for this. As opposed to the Goosebumps movie, which from what I can tell took a lot more of a comedic look at it, this one is clearly for people who were scared of these books and read them as children, and now they're grown up and they're seeing it turned into a bit more of an adult movie. I am cautiously optimistic about this. I do like the director, and the story itself, there seems to be a lot of possibilities for making a really interesting movie. But I should stop speculating and just watch it, so I'll do that. This year's Horror Nights just got a lot better. This movie is great. While there were a couple of problems, overall this was very, very well executed. I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. Even though he didn't direct it, Guillermo del Toro did help with writing the story, and you can tell. There's a lot of very del Toro parts to this movie, especially visually. The illustrations that made the original book so famous were these high contrast charcoal type of things. They weren't that complicated, but they were very striking. And while there weren't a lot of images in this movie that really just hit home as that's the book come to life, there were some elements of that. However, that does bring me into one of the problems with this movie, which is its over-reliance on CGI. Yes, you can make anything with CGI, but just because you can doesn't mean you should. I can't tell you this for sure, but there were some parts of this movie that definitely were CGI, you could easily tell, and there were other ones that looked a lot better, and that was either purely practical effects or a mix of practical effects and CGI together. When you get right down to it, it's almost always going to look better if something is actually there in front of the camera. But that is technically a nitpick. The story, I thought, was very clever. I was wondering how they're going to make a series of short horror stories into a movie, and what they did was that they had it so that there's this, old ghost story legend in this small town about this little girl or young girl who lived with this really rich family, and they locked her in the basement, and kids could go to their house and they would hear her voice through the wall, and she would tell scary stories to them. And in present day, which in this movie is 1968, which I don't understand. I thought the books came out in the 80s. I don't get why this is the 60s. Okay, I get why it was the 60s, because for some reason they had, the Vietnam War and Nixon's election there, but ultimately it wasn't really that important. I mean, it does come into play in the story, but not enough so that it made it imperative that this took place in 1968. But anyway, in present day, this group of high schoolers, I think they're, in their senior year of high school, or they're definitely in high school. They go into this old house on Halloween, and they find a book filled with little stories written in red ink, and the stories start writing themselves on the page, and what the story says is what happens. And from what I can tell, every single one of the things in this movie is one of the scary stories from the books. So they accidentally release something, and now it is killing people every single night, and they need to find a way to put a stop to it. It's a lot kind of like a Scooby-Doo type of thing, but with a supernatural twist. The main characters in this movie were very good. The main actress who played Stella, she did a great job. One of the other main character, Ramon, he did a great job. I really liked the interactions among them. It reminded me of the kids from It that I saw last year, the new one from 2017. And it kind of reminded me of that because they really came off as normal kids interacting with each other. They had a really good setup for it. They had a good story, they had good characters, and this movie is executed very well. There were a couple things, like there were some predictable jump scares in it. One of them I was able to immediately tell what they were going for. And then there were other, like, stupid cheap shot jump scares that were not necessary, because the scariest moments in this movie are the very slow ones, the very quiet ones, the ones where it's not the thing jumping out and making a scary noise, it's like the slow creeping terror of impending death. This story had a firm foundation, it had good people behind it, executed very, very well, and overall it was a really good horror movie. I enjoyed it quite a bit. There were a few problems with it. Probably my biggest issue with it sort of centered around the ending. The ending wasn't bad, but the ending was not as good as it could have been. And I'll explain that more in the spoiler section, but before that, if you want to see this movie, I would definitely recommend it. Check it out. It's a good horror movie. Now let's go into the spoilers. This movie did something that was kind of disappointing in the fact that I had an aha moment with this movie that didn't actually lead to anything. Every single one of these stories ends with a character dying, so therefore every time one of the stories gets written, one of the characters in the movie dies. The first one was the stereotypical cardboard cutout of a bully character. He got killed by a scarecrow, and the second one was what seemed to be one of the main characters. I think his name was August. And he died by the toe ghost, or the toe corpse, that I had heard about before I watched this movie. But the third one was what was really interesting, because in that one, the character didn't die. It was one of the character's sister, her name was Ruth, and it was the thing where, like, she's getting a giant zit that comes from a spider bite, and then it explodes into spiders. But what I thought they were going with here was that I assumed that she was just going to die, because everybody else died. And when the other characters came into the bathroom where it was happening, the lights were off. The lights just turned themselves off, and that sort of formed something in my brain. And when they turned on the light, like, for a split second, you could see the ghost of the girl. I think her name was Sarah Bellows. You saw, like, her ghost, and when the lights went on, it went away. And I thought, wait a minute. That's how you stop it. These are scary stories to tell in the dark. Because the first one, it was in a cornfield at night. It was dark. And the second one, when running away from the toe ghost, he went upstairs and he turned off the light. And he got killed by being dragged under the bed where it was dark. And I thought, that's how you stop it from happening. And I thought that would have been really clever, but they didn't really go with that. Instead, we got the standard Del Toro plot where the real villains were humans. And all this is put to the stop when the main character, Stella, tells the ghost of Sarah Bellows that she will tell her story, the real story, because what happened got completely twisted and, like, turned around into her being a monster instead of her trying to warn the town about her family poisoning the water supply with mercury. And again, it's standard Del Toro type of stuff. It basically just boiled down to her, like, telling the ghost what they did was on them. I'm quoting pretty much exactly. What they did was on them, but what you're doing right now is on you. And then she just stops. It came off as a little bit corny. I'm not gonna lie, just a little bit. And then the ending was kind of weird. Ramon gets sent off to Vietnam because they kept bringing up the Nixon election and, like, draft dodging and stuff like that. So that was part of it, but again, it wasn't enough of a part of it for it to be integral that this takes place during the 1986 election, unless they're trying to make a political statement that I can also guarantee you the books weren't making. But anyway, that ends with her, the main character Stella's dad, and the recovered Ruth, who got the spider zit thing, trying to figure out a way to bring back their two friends that were killed due to the story. And it kind of felt like they were setting up for a sequel, but I don't know where they would go from there. And more importantly, this was a movie that was totally, like, able to just be one movie and end there. If you compare this to, like, The Conjuring 2, which was the best movie from the first 31 Horror Nights, yes, that one did have sort of that feel-good ending and the setting up for a sequel, but that one already was a sequel. And the feel-good ending was a lot more earned because that movie was longer. You got to know the characters a little bit better, and you liked them a lot. I mean, I'm not saying I didn't like the characters in this movie, I did, but I knew Ed and Lorraine Warren a lot better than I knew these people. I want to reiterate, the ending wasn't bad, it just wasn't as good as it could have been. Maybe the In the Dark thing will come up if they ever make a sequel, and if it does, that kind of sucks, but maybe it will come up, I don't know. I mean, there were so many short stories in the 3 books that they could theoretically just keep on making these movies and they would turn into like anthology movies or something. I don't know. I hope they don't do that because this movie seemed like a very contained thing, something that was very inclined to just be a one-time sort of thing. While there were some cheap scares and some not very good effects, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark was driven by its good writing, its good acting, and for the most part, its good visuals. Probably the best scare in this entire movie was the one that was either entirely or mostly practical effects. I think it was the White Lady, this big, fat, like, elongated woman who was approaching one of the characters from all sides. No matter where he turned, she was there, and then she hugged him, and then he got absorbed into her body, and it was very effective. The good moments and the good aspects far outweigh the bad ones in this movie. It's definitely the best movie I've seen so far this month, but I hope we got a lot more movies just as good coming along down the pipeline. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark gets 2 severed big toes up from me. I'll see y'all tomorrow.